First of all, good morning, everyone, and also good afternoon or good evening, based on the time zones you are in. So this is, I'm Partha Mukherjee from School of Mechanical Engineering at Purdue University. And I also serve as a faculty advisor to the ECS student chapter at Purdue. So I would only briefly introduce and welcome our speaker today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome a former Nittany Lions. So we both graduated from Penn State. So Dr. Nella Vargas-Barbosa from Helmholtz Institute Münster in Germany. And she's going to talk something very interesting, her journey into solid-state batteries. With that, let me hand it over to chapter president Sushmita, and Sushmita is going to formally welcome and introduce our speaker. Thank you, Nella, and thank you all very much for attending today. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Sushmita, and currently I'm serving as the president of the student chapter. So those of you who don't know us, so this is the current executive board of this chapter, and we have Dr. Mukherjee and Dr. Laskin serving as our faculty advisor. So as a part of the activity for this student chapter, we have started a webinar series in last fall with speakers from academia, national labs, and industries. So this semester, we are also continuing with that webinar series. And the theme of the webinar series in spring 2021 is Women in Electrochemical Sciences and Engineering. So just for your information, we have Dr. Nicole Vadivel from Form Energy for our next seminar. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Nella Vargas-Barbosa from Helmholtz Institute Münster. So Dr. Nella was born and raised in the island of Puerto Rico, where she also completed her bachelor's in chemistry at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. For her PhD, she attended Penn State University and worked under the mentorship of Tom Malloch on attaining a fundamental understanding of bulk and interfacial processes in photoelectrochemical water splitting cells. She was supported by a Humboldt Fellowship to work in the group of Bernard Rolling at the University of Marburg. Here she developed expertise in the method of impedance spectroscopy as applied to electrode-ionic liquid interfaces and solid electrolyte characterization. After a short stay at Max Planck Institute for Solid-State Research at Stuttgart, working on various energy conversion projects in the group of Bettina Lost, Nella is now an independent group leader at the Helmholtz Institute in Münster. Among other things, the group is interested in elucidating the bottlenecks of charge and mass transport at solid-solid interfaces in thiophosphate-based solid-state batteries. The talk of her title is A Traditional Electrochemist Journey to Working with Solid-State Batteries. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to Dr. Barbosa. You can start to share your screen again.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Now the slides are the right ones, yes? Yeah, okay. Good. So thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Before I continue, or maybe not before I continue. So I actually did a little bit of research on who else got invited on this Women in Electrochemical Science and Engineering series, because I actually felt very honored to be invited. So I really appreciate this and the effort that the students and the advisors are doing to organize this series. Thank you, I really appreciate it. But so these are the speakers that were before me, and all of them spoke about batteries. And if we look closely, they all have entirely different kinds of training. And what that tells me, and perhaps could tell you, is that electrochemical or even battery research is an intrinsically interdisciplinary type of research. And with that in mind, I would like to take you on my journey of how I got into to the field of solid-state batteries in the last couple of years. And so I wasn't sure how many people were going to come here that didn't necessarily have an electrochemical background. So my talk starts when I don't know this, what defining an electrochemical interface. And an electrochemical interface is a surface that forms a common boundary between two portions of matter, but it has the added caveat that we have charge transfer, and we may be able to drive chemical reactions at that interface. And so this is what an electrochemical interface could look like: a rusting metal plate on a bench in the park. Because if we look closer at one of these drops, we will find that the iron metal gets oxidized, releases a few electrons, and behaves as an anode. And then at where is the water droplet, so the oxidized iron goes into the water droplet, and then the electrons combine at this interface where there is air. Yeah, so here we have another interface: liquid gas interface, solid gas interface, where we can then form rust by the reduction of oxygen, okay, where we have our cathode. And so when we look at this seems very simplistic. This is every day occurring all around us, electrochemistry. But the reality is that even such a natural process involves extremely complex transport processes, thermodynamics and kinetics, that are governing everything that is happening here. And so this is the kind of view that I have on interfaces. So we have kind of this, all of these flavors of processes that can take place at these interfaces that are dominated, of course, then by kinetics, thermodynamics, and then just general transport. And we need to find interfaces with F and interfaces, PH, find them and understand them so that we can utilize them for, let's say, charge energy storage, energy storage. So today I would like to walk you through my journey to solid state batteries, and I appreciate the introduction because it kind of already sets the stage in how I structured my talk. And all of these are the logos of all of the different institutions that have supported me in my career and throughout this journey. So let's just dive in. The first step to getting to solid state batteries, in my case, was to work on bioelectrochemical interfaces. So I did my PhD in my home country, the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, and there I worked under the mentorship of Professor Carlos Cabrera in electrochemical DNA biosensors. And so the idea here was to take polycrystalline gold surfaces and modify them with self-assembled monolayers, and perhaps, in my case, we use single-stranded DNA, but you could think about all sorts of possible receptors and bio molecules that you can modify the surface. And then you try to drive redox chemistry to monitor changes at this bioengineered interface that you've created. And so during my time as an undergraduate researcher and working in this project, I learned things like how to assemble an electrochemical cell and connect it to the potentiostat without killing it. Yeah, this was actually at the time for me very easy to do. So at least I crossed that off my list. I got the opportunity to then learn the basics of various electroanalytical methods. So I did like cyclic voltammetry, square wave voltammetry, and a little bit of impedance spectroscopy, but that really set the foundation for the rest of my career. And I was also very lucky to have multiple mentors to learn from. And actually most of them were actually female doctoral students that helped me with these projects. And to them, I'm extremely grateful because they really, this idea of visibility and, you know, seeing someone that looks like you doing what you think you could do in the future for your career is very important. And so I'm very thankful, and I guess I was very lucky to have such a supportive group during my undergraduate. But the bottom line of my work there was that bio things and when they are put into an inorganic surface, this is actually very challenging. Okay, so this, things die and they degrade very fast because the temperature was wrong. And in Puerto Rico, the temperature was always wrong because we have humidity and it's always like 36 Celsius. So I said, okay, this is interesting and it set the stage, but I need to look for other kinds of interfaces in the long run. So that drove me to my second step. This is where I went to Penn State to do my PhD in chemistry under the mentorship of Tom Maluk. And during my time at Penn State, my PhD focused primarily on photoelectrochemical water splitting interfaces. And this is kind of how that looks like. So we had a transparent conductive oxide, fluorine doped tin oxide, for example, and it was modified with a thin film of a mesoporous semiconductor film. In our case, it was mostly N-type titania, TiO2, where then we were able to, or we modified the surface of the titania with an oxygen evolution catalyst so that we can transform water to oxygen in a way that it is entirely driven by light. So light comes in, electron hole pairs are generated, and the holes are transferred to the catalyst that then drives this reaction. And so I did a lot of work of, homogeneous and heterogeneous electrocatalysis, photoelectrocatalysis for this application. So I learned a lot about the kind of traditional electrochemical methods for characterizing catalyst. But I also worked on ion transport in membrane buffer electrolyte systems. And I will highlight this part of my work there because unknowingly, it also gave me more expertise and to think about, ion transport that I can translate now to battery research. Okay, so the idea at the time was that there are, at the time when I was doing my PhD, which now seems like ages ago, but I guess not so long, I don't know. I got my, anyways. So we had these kinds of catalysts that are first row transition metal based catalysts, like the nickel borate, the cobalt phosphate, both from the Nocera group, cobalt oxide, and supported on silica particles by Heinz Frey. And we worked, for example, with iridium oxide nanoparticles. And one of the key things in all of these materials is that there is a pH, so pH gradients and let's say proton control at the surface of the catalyst is very important, in particular for the first row transition metals, because these materials actually start dissolving or degrading at very low pHs. If we consider the fact that for every molecule of oxygen that we generate, we're generating 4 protons, very close to the surface of the catalyst, then we really need to think about how are we going to ensure that these catalysts are stable for a long time. And so we started to think about buffers, and if we think about doing water splitting in a buffered electrolyte, let's say with phosphate buffer, okay? And then we have an anode and a cathode where we want to collect oxygen and hydrogen. Do we actually need a membrane to separate the anode and cathode compartment so that we can collect the gases? And so we looked at things like, this is not particularly new, right? So buffer concentration, as it increases, the conductivity of the solution increases, and the conductivity kind of plateaus and is limited by the solubility of the buffer. This is not particularly new. But what we looked at was what are the potential losses, the voltage losses associated with using these kinds of buffers at a specific kind of cell dimensions. And again, this is simple geometry. We have the applied current density, the area of the electrodes times the distance between the electrode divided by the area of the cell, in this case, the membrane that would separate it, for example, and the solution conductivity. What we find is that for a electrode separation of 1 millimeter, we have a potential loss of about 15 millivolts at these current densities, which at the time were kind of like these benchmark current densities that we should target for photoelectrochemical water splitting systems. And if we look at all of the other losses that are associated with a water splitting system. We have the thermodynamics of 1.23 volts, the anode and cathode potentials, the solution resistivity losses, those of the membrane, if we are actually requiring a membrane, and then additional pH gradients, okay? And the reality is that in order to make these buffered systems, we need to make sure that we keep all of these additional overpotentials at below 700 millivolts. Otherwise, we're not competing with alkaline electrolysis. It's just not there. And so if we look at the literature, typical overpotentials for anode and cathode in buffered systems are between 200 and 400 millivolts. And so we already have about 10 or 15 here if we are at very high concentrations and very small distances. So that means we're definitely going to need a membrane, which we can measure. And then the question was, what is this pH thing doing, and is it a problem? Okay. And we measured this, we measured this as well, but I want to focus on this one here in particular, because when Tom posed us this question, we started thinking, okay, well, what is happening with the ions, right? So we have an anode and a cathode, and unlike PEMs or alkaline electrolysis cells, the charge carriers in a buffered system, especially in a highly buffered system where there's high buffer concentration, are actually the buffering ions. It's no longer protons or hydroxides alone that are moving across the cell. And so we did this balance sheet analysis to try and figure out, okay, how much of the total charge is being carried via migration versus diffusion, and in which direction is everything moving? So in this case, we had an anion exchange membrane. We had the negatively charged phosphate anions that are going to be constantly migrating while the cell is on, from one side to the other, which is already generating a concentration gradient simply by migration. And there's of course diffusion, but is the diffusion actually able to compensate this fast enough? And the answer to that question is not. Okay, so what we did is we ran electrolysis, and then we measured the pH of the cathode and anode after different time points, and then we use this Nernst equation to just calculate the losses, potential losses in pH. And what we observed is that in completely unbuffered systems, this polarization is extremely high. Okay, so already 600 millivolts in about 10 minutes, and this is all at I apologize for the missing data, 25 milliamps per centimeter squared. If we look at a buffer like acetate, about 500 millivolt losses in 18 hours. And in the case of phosphate, we have anywhere between 300 and 500 millivolts of losses in about 24 hours. So this is a problem. And, at the time we were able to say, okay, well, the electrolysis cell is not running all the time. So we did on-off cycles, on for 8 hours, off for 16 hours. And this helps a little bit with the pH gradient, because while it's off, then you have generated enough of a concentration gradient here that it really drives the diffusion in the opposite direction. So it really helps compensating it. But during the time that it's running, it can polarize actually quite significantly. And it doesn't fully reverse. The time it takes to really go back, it's actually very slow. So it was a really big problem, and we started thinking, can we do anything to mitigate it? And at the time, we started working with bipolar membranes. This is perhaps for the people that do membrane chemistry and polymer chemistry are probably very familiar with these kinds of systems, also desalination and so on. These types of membranes had up until that point not really been demonstrated in water splitting systems. Yes, in fuel cells, yes, but not in water splitting systems. And so we were able to demonstrate that actually utilizing such bipolar membranes helps mitigate some of these problems. And this is now a field of research that is, developing entirely on its own. I'm not working on this anymore, but it has found applications both in the water electrolysis field, but also in CO2 reduction. kind of membrane electrode assemblies, kind of setups. So it really kickstarted, a new way of trying to think about the way ions and the electrolyte itself and how we're trying to engineer a device. Yeah. Kind of set the stage for another field of research. So that was very exciting. And I said, okay, I've learned a lot about water splitting. This is, I learned catalysis, I learned about ion transport, but as an electrochemist, I said, okay, I really need to learn something else, And for me, that third step was to learn impedance spectroscopy. And so I said, well, this is a method that not everybody uses. And when I asked some people that did a little bit, like dabbled a little bit with impedance spectroscopy, they said, well, impedance spectroscopy is kind of like a black box, you want to be careful and I don't know, I don't want to talk to you too much about it because I'm not entirely sure how it works and so on. So I said, okay, this is the challenge that I want to take for my postdoc. I'm just going to switch fields and learn impedance spectroscopy. And so I did some research, and then I found Professor Bernhard Rohling at the University of Marburg. He was actually before at the University of Münster, where I am currently at, which is funny how things are connected. And during my time there, again, I learned impedance spectroscopy, which is a method in which you can apply either a potential or current, and in some methods you can actually tune the intensity of an LED light when you're thinking about photoelectrochemical systems. And so you apply it for a certain amount of time, you reach some sort of steady state, and then you start applying with a specific amplitude, you start oscillating that input signal. And so you go from high frequencies to lower frequencies. And so this is where you kind of get this spectrum, yeah? And the idea is that you can then analyze this kind of data. And so I said, okay, let's do that. And I did that with electrode-ionic liquid interfaces. And why we should study these kind of interfaces? Well, the ionic liquids are salts that are in the liquid state at room temperature. And because of that, they have interesting properties that could have applications. So, large electrochemical stabilities for oxidation and reduction. So as potential electrolytes for, let's say, supercapacitors or even some batteries. They have a very low flammability because there's no organic solvents in there. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them have high ionic conductivities, which is also good. And so the applications are extremely broad. But there's a lot of challenges because the interfacial properties are actually very complex and poorly understood. And it's because they have very long screening lengths. Again, we're talking about concentrated systems. So there's a lot of interactions of the ions with one another. And so this already, goes beyond what is typically thought of for the Debye model, for example. And we have conflicting reports on capacitance versus potential curves when we're thinking about the interface itself. This is usually a good metric to characterize that interface, but different groups reported different values and different trends. And also the structure of the solid ionic liquid interface, and this could just be simply a solid, it doesn't have to be an electrode, it could just be like a silica sheet, for example, is actually very complex and also highly dynamic. So, some people, there's ideas that there's kind of like a layered structure of alternating charges. And so it's also very dynamic. If, I don't know, you breathe near it, it kind of changes. So, we don't understand it entirely. And then there's, of course, the influence of impurities. Okay. So in my case, I said, okay, well, if the interface is not very well understood, how about we look at one of the most fundamental properties of an electrochemical interface, and that is the potential of zero charge. So for that, we looked at polycrystalline gold electrodes, and we did immersion experiments. So we had our electrode here, our pure ionic liquid electrolyte with a quasi reference electrode, and then we had our counter electrode here, at the bottom of the cell. This is all peak casing. And all of these measurements were done in an argon glove box. So none of the things here saw anything outside of the glove box. Yeah, so everything was tried to be kept as clean and as pure as possible. And the idea was, okay, we're going to measure the current that is generated upon immersing this clean surface onto the pure ionic liquid electrolyte. And so when we are approaching, so we turn on the potentiostat and say, okay, apply 0.1 volts. And because the electrode is not in the electrochemical cell, we don't measure any current. And so this lag here is just simply the approach in the C direction of the electrode to the surface of the electrolyte. And then once we start contact, we didn't move the electrode anymore. And we observe here in the black trace a sharp increase in the current up to a certain maximum, in which at this point, what we are observing is, or what we expect to be observing is double layer formation and the wetting of the electrode. So we need to wet the electrochemical, the geometric area of the electrode surface. And after you reach that maximum, because you've reached the maximum geometric area, then the current starts decaying, and there is perhaps further double layer charging and any other slower interfacial processes that are taking place. And so we can take the integral of this and we obtain the charge. And so we did this at different potentials, and we obtained the different charges. And then we did a time-dependent analysis. So at different time points, we looked at what was the current that had flowed in the system at a specific time. And so we were able to generate these potential charge curves, which we have the potential here in the x-axis and the charge in the y-axis. And what we observe is that as the time proceeds, we observe that this curve changes significantly. And when you do the fitting, it seems that the potential of zero charge is a time-dependent parameter in these systems. And so this was kind of surprising in a way. And so we wanted to try and understand that better. Okay, so for that we said, okay, let's try impedance spectroscopy. So I told you that impedance spectroscopy is kind of like a black box. It's difficult sometimes to analyze and understand the data and so on. And so when you measure the impedance of a system, and these are at fixed potentials, usually at this type of interface, you would get a spectrum that looks something like this. You get a lot of points here in the bottom, and then it starts slowly curving out. And one is not entirely sure how to fit this. And usually in the literature, the way this is done is you fit a resistor and a constant phase element. The resistor is meant to give you the the resistance between your reference electrode and your working electrode, and it reflects the ionic conductivity of your electrolyte. Whereas the constant phase element from up here is meant to give you the differential capacitance. Yeah, so you can use that to establish the capacitance of the system, or the double layer capacitance. And so we do that, but you can see already that if we do that, we don't really get a good fit. So this is the fit if we do that, and kind of all of these points at lower frequencies don't really get captured by this fit. And so what we did is we just mathematically transformed the impedance from the Nyquist impedance plane to the capacitive plane. And so we just did straightforward complex conjugate math. There's actually a program now that you can just click a button and it does it for you. And then you get such a plot in the right, where now capacitive processes, or processes that are, reflect a capacitance, look like semicircles. They're no longer hidden in this imaginary part that just shoots up to infinity. And so now you can in a completely unbiased way, because this looks like a circle, we decided to use a Cole element, which is pretty much just the equation of a circle, of a semicircle, yeah, to fit this. Where we can then, the delta C Cole gives you the diameter of the semicircle. You get a time constant for the Cole element, which is extracted from this maximum over here. And you also get an alpha parameter, which is telling you about the ideality. How ideal is this semicircle? Yeah, 1 completely ideal, less than 1 less ideality. And so when we look at this, and so okay, we got this, and then we have this tail again at lower frequencies, which we still don't know what it is, and because we don't know what it is, we just fitted it with a constant phase element. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the reality is, in doing this kind of fit, we obtain actually very similar data, because here the diameter of the semicircle is about 7 microfarads, and the kind of capacitance that we would get from this kind of fit is also in the same order. Okay, and the ideality parameter is also, so it's kind of complementary data. But the reality is that in this kind of representation, in our case, we were able to learn a little bit more about what was happening at the interface. So if we look a little bit more closely, we can say that we have a main process that occurs at relatively high frequencies, which we initially assigned to fast double layer charging because it just makes sense that this is what is happening at fast timescales. Whereas then we have, after, you know, a kind of like a transition frequency or about 20 hertz, we see the onset of a slower process. And this is actually consistent with our data. So at very short times of our immersion data, yeah, so at very short times, we observed a differential capacitance that was pretty similar to what we would get from these kinds of semicircles. And the potential, what we extracted from the charge potential curves, the potential zero charge does not vary significantly. And so we interpret that at these short time scales, when we do this charge potential analysis, we're actually extracting the potential of zero free charge. We are looking exclusively at electrostatic screening of the charge of the electrode with that of the electrolyte, nothing else. And then again, at this onset, so about 100 milliseconds, this is about 500. Okay, we have a bit of a resolution problem here, like, but it kind of fits, yeah, a slower charging process. And this slower charging process, again, I said it was a CPE, and we fitted it, and we obtained an alpha parameter of 0.5. 0.5 is pretty much a Warburg element. So diffusion. So we said, okay, diffusion, that slower, okay, is this consistent with our charge traces? So we look at that a little bit more carefully. We have here now the charge of these immersion measurements that we did, plotted as a function of the square root of time for 2 different ionic liquids. And we observe actually relatively good correlations. And what we could take at the time from that is that the electrode charge screening at long time scales seems to be a diffusion limited process. It actually seemed to correlate with the diffusion coefficients of the ions themselves in the ionic liquid. And so we still don't have a full explanation as to why this is the case. But had we not done the impedance analysis, we would have never reached this kind of, this kind of level of insight. But in reaching that level of insight, I started thinking, okay, well, the diffusion coefficients, tracer diffusion coefficient, well, how is that different than like a salt diffusion coefficient? And, I started thinking how much of bulk processes influence interfacial processes. And so I then spent a lot of time working on trying to understand bulk ionic transport in concentrated solid and liquid electrolytes. And this essentially resulted in me with Bernard writing an extremely long review where we actually go through the idea, or we try to explain the theory and then demonstrate that theory in various case studies in which we're looking at ion correlations with themselves, so self-correlations or distinct ion correlations. This ion is correlated with this one and it affects its movement. And as well as then in liquid systems that are highly concentrated, where there's positive correlations between the ions and anti-correlations. And in the particular case of liquids, these correlations actually go beyond the idea of ion pairing. Okay, so we're in this case, we were looking at combining linear response theory with Onsager's irreversible thermodynamics and using these two aspects to determine, okay, how do these kind of correlations determine tracer diffusion coefficients, self-diffusion coefficients, salt diffusion coefficients, and all of the transfer and transport numbers, transference, that's the word, the transference and transport numbers in liquid electrolytes. In the reality, this is very complex, so I'm not going to go into any equations, but you know, during this time in my postdoc, it gave me a lot of time to think in a lot of in-depth in the theory and what are the basics of transport in ionic systems. Okay. And then I said, okay, I've learned a lot. I went a lot into the fundamentals. Now there's something else I need to do. And that is I need to learn how to make my own materials. As a physical chemist, I usually wait for colleagues to send me samples or, you know, tell them, I wish I could have a material that does this. Can you make it? So I said, okay, this needs to stop. I need to learn how to make my own materials. And this is where I did my short stay as a junior group leader at the Max Planck Institute in Stuttgart in the group of Bettina Lodge. And there I was working again a little bit. This is what kind of really kickstarted this idea of the solid electrolytes and looking at solid-solid interfaces, as well as other projects that are more photoelectrochemical in nature. But in me choosing to say, okay, I am going to learn something new, it really opened up the opportunity for me to build up my network within the Lodge group, as well as I was able to help manage the FESPAT project, which is a BMBF funded project on solid state batteries, and then establish collaborations within the e-conversion, as well as other groups. And so through my journey to solid state batteries, it actually happened in a way that it's really based on the network, yeah, and the collaborations that I built via my mentors, as well as just simply self-initiative and say, hey, why don't we measure this? Okay. And so with that, I would like to set the stage for some of our recent efforts in the thiophosphate solid electrolytes for solid state batteries, which I think is kind of what everybody's been waiting on. And so I have three different stories, and I will start with this one. When we were looking at, we were wondering, how do the contact areas at electrode-electrolyte interfaces look in a solid state, when solid versus a liquid? In the case of a liquid electrolyte, it conforms to the roughness of your contact metal electrode. Whereas in the case of a solid electrolyte, you have an intrinsic roughness of your solid electrolyte pellet as well as the metal electrode. And usually the probed area is just too small. And this could lead, if one were to do an electrochemical measurement, this could lead to misinterpretation of data. For example, here is LGPS, so the lithium germanium thiophosphate, kind of like benchmark thiophosphate electrolyte. And we looked at making pellets of it. And so here we have it. And this is the typical configuration, just simply putting two stainless steel working electrodes on each side of the pellet and then running a cyclic voltammogram. And if you do that, it's this black trace here. There's no current or barely any current, or it kind of looks like a square. So it kind of suggests that the material is stable at those potentials and that it would be stable up to 5 volts. But other studies of, cycling thiophosphates against cathode active materials and, exposing it to all sorts of, like looking a little bit more carefully at the interfacial chemistry of thiophosphates with oxide-based materials suggested that they are actually not stable up until these potentials. And the question is, well, can we determine that before? Yeah. And the thought that occurred to us was to increase the surface area. So instead of measuring the pellet directly into a planar electrode, we just mix it, in this case with super P, so just like conductive carbon, and increase the surface area and then run the CV. And when you do that, you observe something like this, where you now have peaks here and you seem to have some other things here. And yes, there is an effect of effective increase of the surface area that kind of increases the amplitude, yeah, or not the amplitude, but kind of this, that broadens this part here. But these redox peaks are like, where do they come from? And so now the question was, okay, well, they definitely degrade, and they degrade at potentials more negative than originally thought of. But what is the actual stability window? How do we define it? And, you know, and are these materials even good for anything at the end of the day? And so in order to get that kind of information, we did stepwise cyclic voltammetry. And the idea here was to start at kind of OCP and then scan to a specific positive potential and then return, do 2 cycles. And if the 2 cycles were kind of on top of one another, so reproducible one another, then you go on to the next one. And this is how we were able to establish this kind of color coding from blue to red, where already starting here, which is about 2.3 volts versus the indium lithium, we start observing degradation. So this is just 1 cycle, but we actually measured 2. Yeah, when they don't overlay over one another, then that was kind of like our cutoff. Okay, our material is starting to degrade. And then you keep pushing it, you keep pushing the oxidative potential, and you start getting all sorts of crazy peaks here. And it was only then with the help of XC2XPS that we were able to tell that these redox peaks here are actually associated to the redox chemistry of the decomposed PS4 and GES4 tetrahedra. Okay, so it used to, and this is very important to clarify, because in the first CV, it almost looked like our material itself was redox active. But the reality is that it is not the electrolyte itself to be redox active, but the decomposition materials. And this can only be seen when you do it like this, in this stepwise manner, because up until this point, so about 2.2 volts, we know that our material is stable. And then suddenly we have redox peaks that are taking place in the same potential range where our material used to be stable. Okay, and so that means that our material starts decomposing. Okay, it's not super stable, but once it starts decomposing, the redox chemistry that we start observing is actually that of the decomposition materials. Okay, and not of the electrolyte itself. So we can simply prevent it. We can simply say, okay, we're not going to push the material past its stability window. And so with that, we did it in various thiophosphate electrolytes, and we were able to establish this kind of, you know, these kinds of ranges for the thiophosphate. So most thiophosphates have a stability of about 3 volts versus lithium, even so the crystalline ones, and also some of the amorphous, maybe a little bit less. And so 3 volts says that they're actually not that, they're not going to be stable with kind of our state-of-the-art oxide cathode active materials. So either we figure out coatings or we figure out a different kind of cathode. So lithium sulfur batteries, solid state batteries would then be a possibility because the potentials are much lower. But what is most important about our results is that the oxidative stability is actually far larger or far greater than what is predicted theoretically. And this was critical, because if we had materials that were only going to be stable up to here, that's simply not going to be enough for applications. And so we're actually very happy to be able to say that there is a practical oxidative stability of these systems. And, you know, it depends slightly on the system, and, you know, it just needs to be studied carefully in order to be determined. Good. Then we have these materials, and these materials are kind of funky because they have sulfur, and, you know, they form H2S if they're exposed to air and water or something. And so it's like, oh, how do we process these? So this is a really big question that we haven't solved yet, but we're working hard on it. And one of the processing processes that we're trying to study is how to, let's say, make thin films. So taking the thiophosphates and exposing them to some sort of organic solvent and using that to kind of, cast a slurry, slurry-based thin film of the solid electrolyte. And so this was done again in the collaboration with the Lodge Group and supported by the FESPAT consortium. And the Lodge Group has tetragonal lithium silicon thiophosphate, which is in the family of the LGPS type solid electrolyte. And it's a material that, as a starting point, has about 1 to 2 millisiemens per centimeter room temperature conductivity. So it's quite competitive. And we looked at what happens when it's exposed to a solvent. And the reality is that we start somewhere up here, the lecips. Upon exposure to any kind of solvent, we tested about 12 or 15, the conductivity always drops. But it's unclear why. And it's also unclear what property of the solvent should we look at to say, okay, this is the threshold for it. We shouldn't go, we shouldn't work with solvents that have a donor number greater than or a polarity greater than, and things like that. This is kind of unclear. And then the other thing that remains unclear is like, well, we start here with lecips, but then we treat it with these kind of solvents and the conductivity drop. But how significant is that drop in the conductivity? Can we trust this? Yeah, so these error bars represent triplicates within the group, but how much do we trust them? And so this is also one of the things that we're still trying to better understand. But it's these kind of questions, like how much do I trust the conductivity that I get from my impedance analysis that triggered this idea of doing the first interlaboratory round robin study. And for that, we thought of the lithium aguarides as a standard as a prototype for a standard electrolyte, because the lithium aguarides, they can, by shifting the composition of the halide, we can tune its total ionic conductivity at room temperature by orders of magnitude. And so, and the material remains in the same structure, and it also remains with the same number of charge carriers. It still remains lithium-6. And so, okay, this is a good prototype, and my collaborator Wolfgang Zeyer and his group, they're the ones doing the synthesis. They made 10 grams of each halide aguaridide that was studied for this study, or that was prepared for the study. 10 grams of each, they were completely homogenized, yeah? And then 1 gram of each electrolyte, we studied 5, were sent to collaborators. And we look collaborators within Germany, as well as international collaborators in the US and also in Asia. Our Asian collaborators are really, at the forefront of, the development of these kinds of new solid electrolytes. And then we simply had them report room temperature conductivities of all of the samples, as well as the activation barriers that they calculated from their Arrhenius curves. And this is what we obtain, which is crazy in some ways. So here are the 5 different samples in a box plot representation. So the line represents the the median, and the dot in the middle of the box represents the average, the mean. And the percentages here are the relative standard deviations of the data. And so look at these ranges, irrespective of the absolute magnitude of the electrolyte, we have extremely large ranges. And we were actually surprised about this. Some of our colleagues were actually, oh, this is to be expected because, everybody has a different setup. So everybody measures things slightly differently. It's like, well, but then, if it's a setup thing, then we must be able to find a parameter that describes this spread, right? And, it's not exclusive to the ionic conductivity, but it's also reflected on the activation barrier. And even though the relative standard deviations are not as bad. But then we try to look at the parameters, experimental parameters that could explain this kind of spread And we really tried to look at everything that we could possibly think of, and we just couldn't find anything. So this is the pressure applied on the powders prior to measurement. So this is like a pre-processing kind of pressure. The dashed line here is the average, and this is the spread, and the range that the standard deviation, I'm sorry, is estimated from these data. Here we have the relative density of the pellets. It kind of increases, but it doesn't fully explain it. We looked at things like cell constant, the excitation voltage that people applied during their measurements, and even pellet thickness. We just couldn't explain it. What was interesting to observe is the influence of the applied pressure during the measurement. So this seems to kind of reflect in press cells. So these were cells that didn't have any kind of sputtered contacts. As you increase the measurement, the pressure at the time of the measurement, you increase the ionic conductivity, which makes sense because in situ, you're ensuring a better grain connectivity. And this then influences your total ionic conductivity that you extract of your system. But it doesn't fully explain the variability that we observe with pellets that were sputtered, let's say, with gold contacts. So it partially explains it. And one of our colleagues can actually measure to extremely low temperatures, so minus 100 Celsius. You can then start deconvoluting grain conductivity or bulk from grain boundaries, even in these very fast conductors. And if you plot here, the total ionic conductivity versus here, the grain conductivity when it can be extracted at low temperatures, and you just extrapolate that, you observe that it kind of explains this thing, which is also kind of reflected here. But again, it still doesn't fully explain the data here when you use a different kind of contact. And so this is actually something that we're now trying to look more carefully. So really this idea, the influence of processing and, the conditions that you use for your measurement for the kind of, ionic conductivity that you report. And so, so this is something we're trying to better understand now and kind of really deconvolute all of these effects from one another. And so again, then I'm now towards the end. And so the sixth step is to go out on your own. And so this is where I am right now. I'm a young investigator group leader. And this started August 2020, so actually quite recent and in the middle of the pandemic. And going out on your own essentially means recruiting students and postdocs, write proposals, write, submit, and revise manuscripts, learn a lot about admin work. There is so much admin work that one has to deal with when one is alone. I know all other professors, PIs that are here would agree. And then of course, sharing your ideas with others. And, this leads to essentially, new collaborations where you can recruit and exchange students and postdocs. And so I really appreciate all of you for the invitation and for your attention and your time. And with that, I can take questions. Oh, I guess maybe I should acknowledge the funding agencies and everybody that supported my journey up until now. And then again, thank you all.
Excellent, Nella. Thank you very much. This is an exciting talk and your journey. So